Greetings and welcome to the online lecture for History 103's class for October 18th. That's Wednesday. What I want to do today is to quickly finish up our look at the global legacies of the French Revolution, and then I want to turn to the second seismic change that transforms the world, starting in the late 18th century, and that's the Industrial Revolution. So if we finish our recap of the longer-term impacts of the French Revolution, I already pointed out to you that it destroys what I call feudal institutions, that is, this world based on privilege and hierarchy in not in all places in Europe, obviously, but certainly in France, where inherited title now was no longer a prerequisite for getting a bureaucratic job and things like that. Secondly, and more broadly, I argue that the French Revolution really creates this idea of the nation, this common home for people within the borders of a state, people who share certain characteristics. And as part of that, the French Revolution really creates the modern idea of nationalism. How do you create nationalism? Well, you begin to try to rewire the way people identify with the world. You do it through symbols, you do it through songs, through practices, and this is an ongoing process. Modern nationalism takes time to be built, and we'll see in the 19th century that a lot of nations, whether it's the United States or other places around the world, are going to go to a lot of effort to try to make their people believe that they're part of a bigger whole. On top of that, there are other kind of longer-term political ideologies, and I should say with nationalism, by the way, certainly nationalism helps drive the European and North American domination of the globe by the end of the 19th century, but nationalism will also be part of the backlash against imperialism in the 20th century. So it cuts both ways. When we think about other modern political isms and legacies, certainly one of the chief ones would be abolitionism. Between 1780 and 1890, slavery loses its global sort of foothold. Can we credit the French Revolution for this? Sort of. Now, there certainly was already anti-slavery sentiment, particularly in Great Britain, driven by either an Enlightenment understanding of human equality, or there was often religious opposition to slavery from groups like the Quakers. But certainly the French Revolution temporarily frees slaves in the French colonies, and in the case of Saint-Domingue, witnesses a huge slave uprising that creates a free republic led by former slaves. The example of Haiti also inspires further revolts elsewhere, particularly in the British sugar-producing islands of the Caribbean, that's going to put a lot of pressure on Great Britain to do something about slavery. And in fact, Britain, in two steps, will move to get rid of slavery. In 1807, it will forbid the slave trade within its empire, and in 1834, it will emancipate those slaves who are remaining. Now, this doesn't end slavery globally, obviously, but it certainly begins to challenge it overall. In South America, many of the revolutions that produce new governments, the independent governments in South America and in Central America, many of those new regimes banned slavery, although not everywhere. It wasn't the case. In North America, obviously, it takes the Civil War in the United States to end slavery by 1865, although officially earlier than that. Brazil is the last country in the Western Hemisphere to formally abolish slavery, which it does in 1888. So we could see the French Revolution as part of this movement towards this. Now, the end of slavery doesn't always change labor and race relations. That's very key. Think about the American South, where a lot of former slaves end up as sharecroppers, basically not owning land by the 1880s and being subject to abject poverty as well. Plantation labor also continues in the Caribbean, even in places where slavery has been abolished. So I don't want you to make this sound like the French Revolution does away with this, but the French Revolution helps set in motion the process that's already begun, but a process that will eventually abolish at least plantation slavery in the Western Hemisphere. What else can we say about other legacies of the French Revolution? Well, I have two of them, as the slide shows there: feminism and socialism. Feminism, this notion of women's equal position in society, we saw really how the French Revolution dealt with it very problematically. In other words, the French Revolution opens up the space for people to, and women particularly, to make the claims for equality. So that fact in and of itself is significant, but we also saw how most claims for female equality are more or less quietly ignored and denied. I have the term socialism up there, which is a term that will mean a lot more in the 19th and 20th century. Socialism, at least in its 19th century sense, is boils down to a notion of widespread equality. Equality not just in terms of rights, but also in terms of property. And there are factions within the French Revolution who are going to argue that that's really what's necessary, that holding property in common, doing away with private property, is really going to be the key to restructuring society. The French Revolution doesn't fully act on those currents, but you could argue that the inspiration of the French Revolution will be in the minds of 19th century groups that are going to call themselves socialists and going forward too. More broadly, we can say that the French Revolution, both in France and globally to a certain extent, attacks the supremacy of the church, mostly the Catholic Church, and its monopoly on power and on knowledge. In France itself, during the Revolution, the church's control over private life is weakened, so divorce becomes briefly possible. And religious minorities, Jews and Protestants, gain full civic equality, which they didn't have before. The sort of challenge to the supremacy of the church is also going to play out much later over the course of the 19th century in lots of places around the world. South America is actually a good example where most of those newly independent countries will have real rifts between conservatives who want to prop up what looks like something like the old order and people who are going to call themselves liberals in the 19th century sense. That basically means that they want to be able to have free speech and to do what they want with their property, but who are also skeptical about the role of religion. So the French Revolution doesn't introduce hostility to organized religion. The Enlightenment had done that earlier, but it is certainly going to mount a serious attack on the power of organized religion in society that's going to play out in ensuing decades. And finally, the French Revolution, as we've hopefully made clear, is also a lot about violence. It is, on the one hand, this moment of possibility, the sense that things can be rewired, but violence is part of that process of doing it. And that violence, the notion of revolutionary violence that's present here in the French Revolution, is going to resurface throughout the 19th and into the 20th century. Think something like the Russian Revolution or the Mexican Revolution, which are going to, in some ways, replay acts of the French Revolution in a new context. Okay, so hopefully this gives you a sense that the French Revolution is not just this moment that's contained between 1789 and roughly 1799, but that has real implications, not just in France, but global implications for the political order, but also in terms of the long-term intellectual legacies that I'm highlighting here. The notion of the nation, abolitionism, feminism, socialism, challenges to organized religion, the role of violence in revolution. These are going to be central to the experience of the 19th and 20th century. So we'll give the French Revolution credit or blame for that. Now I want to move on to something slightly different. Well, it's related though. That is really the second huge upheaval to the world order that begins in the late 18th century and is going to continue through into the 19th century. And that's what we come to call the Industrial Revolution. And I'll give a brief overview of it here, and I think the basic significance, if we want to shoot right to that, is that the Industrial Revolution shifts the creation of industrial capitalism, shifts the relative world balance of power firmly into the European and North American camps. So it completes the process that we've begun to see in motion already in the 18th century, where the 17th and 18th century, where Europeans weigh more heavily on the world. But it's the Industrial Revolution which gives backing to some of the more abstract ideas of, say, the French Revolution, the role of the nation, that will justify, that will really concretize the shift of power towards European and North American hands. Okay. The Industrial Revolution, or Industrious Revolutions as your text calls it, is a complex set of things, but in short I think we can say that a base definition would be it's the substitution. Actually, the way I worded this is it's basically replacing tools operated by hand or foot or animal power with machines driven by water power and then eventually steam. Okay, that's the basic word here, is that replacing human or draft animal power with water power or steam power. It occurs at different rates and in different places, but we're going to focus mostly on Great Britain because Great Britain is really the forerunner. It's the place where these developments happen most intensely and earliest, and it's Great Britain that kind of sets the template for what is going to happen later. What made it possible, particularly in Great Britain? I call these preconditions and accelerators. First of all, the population is rising across Europe, Great Britain too, due to a variety of factors. The birth rate is increasing, but also the death rate is dropping due to things like improved hygiene. Advances in medicine meant that people didn't die in childbirth and lived longer. Basic rudimentary kinds of inoculations against infectious diseases. And then there were fewer wars, at least in the 18th century, that affected the bulk of people where they lived. There was also a greatly improved food supply. That's not on the slide. Changes to the world of agriculture in the 18th century had driven a lot of small farmers off the land in Great Britain, and had basically turned a lot of small little farms into bigger farms owned by one group or one person. This is a process called enclosure, and it has disruptive social impacts. But it's certainly what it does is it allows for sort of more heightened agricultural production and experimentation. It also drives the population that had formerly lived in the countryside somewhere else, and many of them will end up in cities. Cities which are growing in population too. Cities where the people themselves increasingly are demanding goods and consumer products, which of course is a feedback loop that's going to reward industrial innovation. So population rise is fairly central to making the Industrial Revolution possible. In the case of Great Britain, and to a lesser extent others too, overseas expansion and colonialism has helped the process. It's overseas markets supply resources, and they also are markets for goods. The slave trade, as I argued earlier, was actually, I think, a driver of early capitalism. Overseas empires, in the case, say, of Great Britain, their increasing foothold in North America provides them with a lot of forest products and fish. All these are important, too, for sustaining population growth. So overseas expansion plays a role there, too. And there's some other conditions that are present, particularly in Great Britain. Great Britain has a merchant navy that ensures for relatively easy transit of goods across the oceans. Great Britain also has increasingly sort of political supremacy in Europe and globally, and so that makes it sort of possible for it to dominate world trade. There is a well-established credit and banking system, which allows for commercial growth. The state itself is pretty stable. There aren't huge upheavals in Great Britain in the 18th and early 19th century. And that state is busy doing things like investing in railroads, in bridges, and in canals. So it's building out the infrastructure that's going to make industrialization possible. Now, some of these are happening elsewhere, but it's particularly happening in Great Britain. Those kinds of infrastructures like canals and railroads help link internal markets within Great Britain, thus increasing the ability for goods to circulate and be consumed. So Great Britain has all of these things happening. And the fact of the matter is that once it kind of breaks through in terms of the Industrial Revolution, it's really going to set the template for it, and it's going to put a lot of other countries at a relative disadvantage because they are going to be scrambling to catch up to it. And arguably the conditions that I've outlined here don't exist in the great old world empires of China or the Middle East or India, and in part that explains why the Industrial Revolution just doesn't happen there, much to the with a great influence on the way the future kind of balance of power in the world develops. Okay, when we think about the Industrial Revolution, we think about steam power, but let me tell you about why steam power is actually important. Key to the Industrial Revolution are three related interrelated industries. Textile manufacturing, which I have up here. That is sort of making fabrics, making cloth, and then turning it into clothing or other things. Textile manufacturing, coal mining, and the manufacture of metals, particularly the creation of steel. And all of these are enhanced by the mechanical power of the steam engine. So steam power, if we go back to this slide, early steam engines were developed in the early 1700s, but it's James Watt who perfects a more versatile steam engine in the 1770s that has a rotary motion as well as an up and down one, so it's more efficient. And so steam power gets applied to all these other core sectors of the industrial economy. It gets applied to textiles, first of all. First of all, in the process of taking cotton and spinning it, turning it into thread. Then it gets turned to the process of weaving that thread with the power loom. So by the 1780s, you have sort of mechanized looms for weaving. It's applied to the mining industry as well. Steam power is essentially harnessed to pump water out of mines. So ironically, coal, I should have made this clear, coal is usually what's driving steam power. Coal-powered steam engines are being used to get water out of mines to get more coal. And that steam power is already being used to sort of make the textile industry possible. It's also part of the process of making stronger metal alloys, making new kinds of steel. In the late 18th century, there are improvements basically to how iron is heated and melted using coal. Coal, as it turns out, can heat iron much more effectively and quickly, and I think actually to a higher temperature than, say, using charcoal or firewood. And so this makes real innovations in metal production and metallurgy, turning iron into steel. And you think about it, of course, steel is also essential to the basic ways basic forms of transportation of the early 19th century, of the Industrial Revolution. Railroads, for sure, which are a product of the late 1820s and onward. Canals probably aren't necessarily built initially with steel, but probably become part of the process of shipping and transit. So what we see here is the way that these three key industries all interrelate to each other, all benefiting from steam power to continue to expand and transform the British economy. All of these innovations, all these changes to the economy, promote, and I think I already highlighted this, the concentration of industry, resources, and people in cities, the process of urbanization. The growth of cities is just incredible in the 19th century, the first half of the 19th century, in a place like Great Britain. London, of course, was the great capital, had been a great city since roughly since the 15th, 16th centuries. But it grows too in the 19th century. But the most dramatic growth happens in new cities up in the north. Cities like Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool. Cities now that we mostly think about in terms of Premier League football clubs. But their moment of prominence, really, they come into their own. They come into their existence, really, in the first half of the 19th century. Their growth is absolutely spectacular. Manchester grows from, I think, about 70,000 people in 1800 to over 300,000 by 1850. Leeds and Liverpool have similarly huge jumps. In those cities, the reason for their growing, of course, has to do with their proximity to sort of the key locations of the textile industry and also mining and metallurgy. Now, this gives you a sense of what's happening across Europe more broadly. I've been talking mostly about Great Britain because I'm arguing that Britain kind of takes the lead here. I don't want to suggest that the process of industrialization isn't happening elsewhere. It is, but it's happening mostly in pockets. It's happening in what becomes Belgium. It's happening in parts of northern France, parts of the German-speaking world, and little enclaves elsewhere, mostly in proximity to coal and to steel, or to iron and steel production. Those are really the drivers of industrial growth in the 19th century. Wherever it happens, industrialization brought with it, as I suggested, greater urbanization, and it brought real fears about the conditions of people living in cities, the conditions of what are going to be known as working class people. There are real fears from the early 19th century onwards that sort of these new urban masses are dangerous, that they pose a real threat to public order. This is a print, not that you really need to know this, of what's called the Peterloo Massacre, where troops fire on a big crowd outside Manchester. By the way, the "loo" suffix there was really the 19th century's equivalent of "gate" in the 20th and 21st centuries. So Lou from Waterloo was tacked onto anything else to make it seem worse. So Peterloo is the massacre that takes place in the St. Peter's fields. But beyond sort of fears about working class folk, there's certainly efforts to figure out kind of what's going on in cities. There are all sorts of investigations and inquiries. And the primary source that you read for today that we're not really going to get a chance to discuss, the debates over the Factory Act of 1833, really are interesting and revealing debates because they show an investigation into working conditions with an eye towards possibly regulating the workday. And most people in Great Britain are pretty loath to do anything to shorten working hours. So that while there's some concern that people in workplaces are becoming deformed and dying early and suffering health problems, there isn't a lot of stomach for significant changes because, by and large, most people, most non-working class folks in the 19th century saw poverty and urban overcrowding as kind of natural parts of the economic system. This is what we would call laissez-faire economics, the idea that the economy should basically be left alone to regulate itself. But is also very much what we would also call 19th century liberalism. Liberalism, not to be confused with what Fox News would like you to believe it is in the current sense. Liberalism in the 19th century, or what liberalism actually is in the current sense, liberalism in the 19th century basically means men of property wanting to have free speech rights and the ability to move their property around freely. And as such, most sort of people in the 19th century don't really want to do a whole lot to remedy urban poverty because they see it as kind of a natural thing. They see industrial growth, too, as something that's exciting, even if it is generating sort of these horrible working conditions. And even those reformers, most of them, who looked at urban poverty and short lifespans and the generally wretched fate of the urban working class, most of them blamed the poor themselves for the fact that they were living in such conditions and argued, that if only the poor didn't buy alcohol or have too many kids, they wouldn't be so poor. Now, these are arguments that still seem to be circulating today. In terms of alcohol, I think that's worth highlighting because there's a real disconnect between sort of middle class, what we would call now middle class, sort of property-owning folk, and the working class over this. People in the middle class looked at workers who drank beer on the weekends or gin as being hopelessly morally depraved. But honestly, if you were a worker in 19th century Manchester, you certainly wouldn't want to drink water. You wouldn't probably have a functioning tap water system anyway, but you certainly wouldn't want to drink water because it would be hopelessly polluted by industrial waste. So gin or beer would actually be much safer for you to drink. Alcohol consumption is also linked to a kind of working class sociability, how people actually kind of made connections and friends in their lives. And so that's really an interesting example, I think, of the way that outside observers looked at working class life and said, bad, 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 you're depraved and morally bad, and that's why you're so poor. But people in the working class would probably point to the structural conditions that prevented them from actually making any money, and would also highlight the positive aspects of working class community that, say, something like alcohol consumption entailed. Okay, so in general, what I've highlighted here very briefly is the way the Industrial Revolution takes root in Great Britain. It's driven by those three key sectors of the economy: textile production, coal mining, metallurgy, all enhanced with steam power. All this facilitates a greater urbanization, which you have a growing urban markets that are linked to each other, so you're stimulating demand for more goods. But you're also creating a sort of growingly visible poor underclass about which people are kind of uncertain as to what to do. The conventional response is to not really do very much, but there are alternatives that are being proposed, alternatives that try to explain the situation differently. One of them is what we would call utopian socialism, and let me give you a couple examples here. This man with the cheerful-looking face is a man named Robert Owen, who owned some textile mills up in northern England. And he became convinced that the current system wasn't working, and what was really needed was first of all, he argued that everyone should have widespread education, that this would actually allow anyone, no matter how humble their birth, to be able to rise in society. He also promoted a series of model cooperatives where people kind of lived and worked together. This didn't really take root in Great Britain, but in the United States there were several. This is a sketch, by the way, of what he envisioned as something called New Harmony. There are some Owenite collectives that are set up in the United States. If any of you have read Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, her family lived on a Owenite collective in the 1820s called Brook Farm. There also, if you look at the map, there are places like New Harmony, Indiana, which was originally an Owenite collective. So the idea here is to kind of break away from the mold of increasing industrial capitalism to create self-sustaining communities, equal communities. Another reformer who came up with proposals to challenge the existing status quo was this wonderfully attractive-looking man named Francois-Marie Charles Fourier. Fourier is what we know him as, who also wrote a ton at the beginning of the 19th century. Fourier believed, actually, that what was really required, he had an incredibly specific and, you might say, wackadoodle vision for how to reorganize the world. He argued that basically people were miserable because they inherently wanted to do certain things and modern life prevented them from doing them. So he had a whole breakdown of what he saw as 800 different passions, and what he called passions, which were enthusiasms. He proposed that you set up model sort of collectives of 1,600 people, so roughly one male and one female of every, what he called, passion. And that way, then people would be able to find things to do that attracted them. They would be attracted to people who attracted them. So it was basically an attempt to kind of create a collective, although not an equal collective, based on this vision that humans innately wanted to do certain things and you couldn't force them to do others. He called this the phalanstère or the phalanstery. As you can probably imagine, none of these ever really got off the ground. Although there was a Fourierite attempt to settle in what is now Dallas by a bunch of Swiss watchmakers in the 1840s, and surprisingly, since none of them knew anything about farming, the collective collapsed. But you can see, looking at both Fourier and Owen, these were people who were described as socialist because they seem to be thinking about the equality of everybody. They're also going to be labeled as utopian socialists. They're thinking of a better world, arguably a world that doesn't exist. Now, there's some other attempts to make the situation better. In Great Britain, at least, the Parliament will pass some laws to try to clean up cities, to try to limit work hours, but this is all very tentative and it's very limited. The biggest movement that sort of articulates working class demands, at least before 1848, is a movement in Great Britain in the 1830s and early 40s called Chartism. And the Chartists basically were responding to what they saw as the condition of the working class, and they argued that political changes need to take place. And so they proposed something called the People's Charter, which demanded that all men had the right to vote, that all electoral districts in Great Britain be the same, that there'd be secret vote by secret ballot, that elections happen every year, and that members of Parliament get paid. All of these are seen as ways of trying to put more of a working class voice into politics. Doesn't happen, really, or it mostly peters out, although some of those reforms eventually get implemented. But I think what it tells us is that there is certainly agitation from below for a different kind of path forward, at least in Great Britain. And finally, and I don't have a slide about this, but the last current that's going to envision the world a little bit differently, the world to work differently, are the working class movements that are going to come under the influence of Karl Marx, who's writing really in the late 1840s and onward. Marx, who's going to envision a very different world, is going to argue that the world is driven by class conflict, and that the great coming conflict of the 19th century is the conflict between what he calls the bourgeoisie, the property owning class, and the proletariat, which owns nothing except its labor. And Marx argued that what was inevitable was that the proletariat would overthrow the bourgeoisie and would come to control all the means of production, all private property. That's getting a little ahead of our story. That really is mostly relevant when we get into the 20th century, but I highlight that here because it's coming out of in responses to the Industrial Revolution that envisions a different path forward. Okay, so that was a lot of material and I've moved pretty quickly, but hopefully that gives you a sense of sort of both the legacies of the French Revolution, and then this thing that we call the Industrial Revolution. On Friday, when we come back, we'll think of alternative responses to the world as it is changing outside of the European core. So thank you very much for listening, and I will see you on Friday.